I paid my stepfather's medical bills without telling anyone, but now he's asking for a truck, and my mom thinks I'm selfish for drawing a line. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who pays someone's medical bills in secret and then gets called selfish for refusing to buy them a truck. But here I am, sitting in my kitchen at 2 a.m., staring at bank statements that tell a story my family doesn't even know exists. 3 days ago, my stepfather Marcus asked me to help him buy a $42,000 pickup truck. When I said no, my mother called me ungrateful and selfish. What they don't know is that 6 months ago, I quietly paid $16,800 in medical bills that would have cost them their house. My name is Ryan, and I'm 31 years old. I work in software development for a mid-sized company, making decent money, but nothing extraordinary. My mother Helen married Marcus when I was 14, 2 years after my biological father died in a workplace accident. Those were rough years for Mom and me. She worked as a dental hygienist, picking up extra shifts wherever she could, while I tried to help out with part-time jobs and keeping our small apartment clean. Marcus changed everything for us. He was a plumber who ran his own small business, and while he wasn't wealthy, he provided the stability we desperately needed. He moved us into a real house with a yard, helped me get my first car, and treated me like his own son from day one. When I graduated high school, he offered to help with college costs even though money was tight. I declined, choosing community college and state school to minimize debt, but his offer meant everything to me. Marcus has always been the type of man who gives more than he receives. Over the years, I watched him help elderly neighbors with free plumbing work, lend money to relatives who rarely paid him back, and volunteer his time for church projects. He never complained about being taken advantage of, just kept helping people because that's who he is. His generosity sometimes worried Mom, especially when his business hit slow periods, but Marcus always managed to keep things afloat. About 10 months ago, Marcus started having problems that he brushed off as getting older. He'd get winded easily, complained about chest tightness after heavy work, and seemed more tired than usual. Mom kept telling him to see a doctor, but Marcus is stubborn about medical care. He grew up in a family where you only went to the hospital if you were dying, and old habits die hard. The heart attack happened on a Wednesday afternoon while he was working on a customer's water heater. His apprentice found him collapsed in the basement and called 911. I got the call from Mom while I was in a meeting at work. She could barely speak through her tears, just kept saying that Marcus was in the hospital and I needed to come right away. The drive to the hospital was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Marcus had become more than a stepfather to me over the years. He was the man who taught me to drive, helped me move into my first apartment, and called me every few weeks just to check in. The thought of losing him felt impossible to process. The surgery went well, but recovery was going to be expensive and lengthy. Marcus needed a triple bypass, followed by months of cardiac rehabilitation and medication. His business insurance covered about half the costs, leaving them with bills that seemed impossible to manage. I watched my mother age 10 years in 2 weeks as she tried to figure out how they would survive financially. Marcus couldn't work for at least 4 months, maybe longer. His business would essentially shut down during his recovery, eliminating their primary income. Mom was already working full-time, and taking on extra shifts would be difficult while also caring for Marcus during his recovery. They tried to hide their financial stress from me, but I could see it in their faces every time I visited. One evening, I overheard them discussing selling the house and moving into a smaller rental. Marcus kept apologizing, saying he should have taken better care of his health, that he was ruining everything they'd built together. The defeat in his voice was heartbreaking. That night, I went home and looked at my finances. I'd been saving aggressively since college, living in a modest apartment and driving an older car while building up my emergency fund and down payment savings for a house. I had $19,500 in savings, money I'd planned to use for a home purchase within the next year. I called the hospital billing department the next morning. After explaining that I was Marcus's stepson and wanted to handle his outstanding medical bills, they transferred me to a financial counselor. The total amount owed after insurance was $16,800. I gave them my credit card information and paid the entire balance, specifically requesting that they not mention my payment to Marcus or Mom. 2 weeks later, Mom called me crying with relief. She said the hospital had contacted them about some kind of charity program that had covered Marcus's remaining bills. I just said how wonderful that was and changed the subject. They never questioned their good fortune, probably because they were too relieved to think critically about it. Marcus recovered steadily over the following months. By month 4, he was back to light work. By month 6, his business was operating normally again, though he'd hired an additional helper to reduce his physical workload. I was genuinely happy seeing them get their lives back on track, and my sacrifice felt completely worthwhile. Then Marcus started talking about needing a new work truck. The truck situation began innocently enough 3 weeks ago. Marcus had been driving the same Chevrolet pickup for 14 years, and it was finally reaching the end of its useful life. The transmission was starting to slip, the air conditioning had failed, and he'd already put more money into repairs this year than the truck was worth. For his plumbing business, having reliable transportation wasn't a luxury, it was essential. Initially, Marcus was looking at practical options. Used trucks in the $12,000 to $18,000 range that would serve his business needs without breaking the bank. Mom was supportive but cautious about taking on debt so soon after the medical crisis. I offered to help him research options and even volunteered to accompany him to look at vehicles. But somewhere along the way, Marcus's truck shopping evolved into something different. The vehicles he showed me got progressively newer and more expensive. He started talking about how hard he'd worked his entire life, how he deserved something nice for once. The practical work truck search became a quest for the perfect combination of functionality and luxury. During a family dinner 2 weeks ago, Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me pictures of a brand new pickup with premium features. The price tag was $42,000. He started explaining how this truck would last him 20 years, how the warranty would save money in the long run, how important it was to buy quality. I tried to steer the conversation toward more affordable options, but Marcus seemed fixated on this particular model. He mentioned how successful I'd become in my career, how proud he was of my financial stability. The hints weren't subtle. He was building up to asking me to help pay for this truck. The direct ask came during a visit to their house last weekend. Marcus called me into his garage while Mom was inside preparing dinner. He showed me the truck's specifications again, then looked at me with a hopeful expression. His request was framed as an investment opportunity. He would handle the monthly payments, but he needed help with the down payment and fees, about $15,000 total. He assured me it was temporary, that he'd pay me back once his business picked up again. The way he presented it made it sound like I'd be doing him a favor by lending him the money. I felt trapped. Marcus had been good to me and Mom for 17 years. He'd helped shape me into the man I am today. But $15,000 was nearly everything I had left in savings after paying his medical bills. And something about the request felt wrong. This wasn't about transportation necessity. It was about wanting something expensive and expecting family to make it possible. I asked for time to think about it, which clearly wasn't the answer Marcus was hoping for. His enthusiasm dimmed, and he started talking about how family should help family, how he'd always been there for me when I needed support. The guilt was heavy and immediate. That evening, Mom brought up the truck conversation. She mentioned how excited Marcus was about the possibility, how much he'd been through this year with his health problems. She didn't directly ask me to help, but her meaning was clear. She expected me to step up for the man who'd stepped up for us years ago. Over the next few days, the pressure intensified in subtle ways. Marcus would send me text messages with truck photos and comments about financing options. Mom would mention during phone calls how tired Marcus looked driving his unreliable old truck to job sites. They weren't demanding anything outright, but the expectation was building. The situation reached a breaking point 3 days ago when Marcus's brother visited for dinner. During the meal, Marcus announced that we were working together on getting him a new truck. He talked about it like the decision had already been made, describing the features and timeline as if my financial contribution was guaranteed. His brother congratulated me on being such a good son, taking care of family when they needed help. I sat there feeling cornered, realizing that Marcus had essentially committed me to this purchase without actually confirming my agreement. If I backed out now, I wouldn't just be disappointing him. I'd be embarrassing him in front of family. After dinner, I pulled Marcus aside and told him I needed to be honest about my financial situation. I explained that $15,000 was more than I could afford right now, that I had my own financial goals and obligations to consider. Marcus's reaction surprised me. Instead of understanding, he seemed genuinely confused about why I couldn't help. He pointed out that I made good money, lived modestly, and didn't have major expenses like a mortgage or family. In his mind, My financial success created an obligation to share with family members who had less. The conversation grew tense when I suggested he consider a less expensive truck. Marcus said he was tired of driving junk, that he'd worked hard his entire life and deserved something nice. He reminded me of times he'd helped me, moments when he'd been there during difficult periods. Each example felt like a stone being added to a growing pile of guilt. When I maintained that I couldn't afford to help with the truck purchase, Marcus's disappointment was obvious. He said he understood, but his tone suggested otherwise. The easy warmth that usually characterized our relationship felt strained, replaced by something colder and more distant. Mom called me the next morning. She was disappointed and confused about my refusal to help Marcus with the truck. She reminded me of everything he'd done for our family, how he'd provided stability during the hardest period of our lives. Her voice carried a note of bewilderment, as if she couldn't understand how I could be so ungrateful. The word selfish came up multiple times during our conversation. Mom seemed to view my financial boundaries as evidence of selfishness, as if having money created an automatic obligation to spend it on family needs. She couldn't understand why I would prioritize my own financial goals over Marcus's desire for a nice truck. What made the conversation particularly painful was knowing about the medical bills I'd already paid. In their minds, I was being stingy with money I'd never shared. In reality, I'd already given more than they could imagine, but I couldn't tell them that without completely changing the dynamic of our relationship. I ended the call feeling frustrated and misunderstood. Marcus and Mom saw my refusal as evidence that I didn't value family the way I should. I saw their expectations as unfair pressure to make a major financial sacrifice for something that wasn't truly necessary. We were operating from completely different perspectives about money, obligation, and family loyalty. The aftermath of refusing to help with the truck has been brutal and eye-opening. Over the past 3 days, I've watched my relationship with Marcus and Mom deteriorate in ways I never expected. The disappointment in their voices when they talk to me is unmistakable, and I'm starting to feel like a stranger in the family I've been part of for 17 years. Yesterday, Mom came to my apartment unannounced. She looked tired and stressed, older than I'd seen her since Marcus's heart attack. She sat on my couch and tried one more time to convince me to help with the truck purchase. Her approach was different this time. Less direct pressure, more emotional appeal. She talked about how much Marcus had been through this year, how the heart attack had scared both of them about mortality and the future. She mentioned that his old truck had broken down twice in the past week, leaving him stranded at job sites and frustrated with his inability to provide reliable service to customers. The mechanical problems weren't just inconvenient, they were threatening his business reputation. Mom also brought up Marcus's pride and how hard it had been for him to ask me for help in the first place. She said he'd agonized over the request for weeks, worried that I'd think he was taking advantage of our relationship. The fact that I'd said no had hurt him more than he was letting on, not just financially but emotionally. What struck me most about our conversation was how genuinely confused Mom seemed about my position. She kept returning to the same basic question. If I had the money and Marcus needed help, why wouldn't I want to help him? In her worldview, family obligation trumped personal financial planning. The idea that I might have legitimate reasons for saying no seemed foreign to her. I tried to explain my perspective without revealing the medical bill payments. I talked about having my own financial goals, about the importance of maintaining boundaries even within families, about the difference between needs and wants. But I could see that my arguments weren't resonating. To Mom, I was choosing money over family, and no philosophical discussion about boundaries was going to change that perception. The conversation ended with Mom looking disappointed and me feeling like I'd failed some fundamental test of character. After she left, I sat in my empty apartment wondering if I was actually being selfish. Maybe they were right. Maybe having the means to help created an obligation to help, regardless of personal financial goals. That evening, Marcus called me directly. His tone was different from our previous conversations, more resigned than angry, more hurt than demanding. He said he understood that I couldn't help with the truck, but he wanted me to know how much my refusal had affected him. Marcus talked about feeling like he'd misjudged our relationship. He'd always thought of me as his son, not his stepson, and he believed that bond meant we'd support each other through difficult times. My refusal to help had made him question whether I really considered him family or just someone who'd married my mother. The pain in his voice was genuine and heartbreaking. Marcus wasn't trying to manipulate me with guilt. He was sharing real hurt about feeling rejected by someone he loved. He talked about lying awake at night wondering what he'd done wrong, how he'd misread our relationship so badly. I wanted to tell him about the medical bills, to explain that I'd already helped more than he knew, but something held me back. Revealing the payment would solve the immediate problem but create new complications. Marcus would feel obligated to pay me back, which would strain their finances. He'd also feel guilty about the truck request, which might damage his self-esteem even further. Instead, I found myself apologizing for hurting his feelings while maintaining that I couldn't afford to help with the truck. It was an unsatisfying compromise that left both of us feeling misunderstood and distant from each other. This morning, I made a decision that I've been avoiding for weeks. I called the hospital billing department and requested detailed records of Marcus's account, including payment history. I needed documentation of what I'd done, even if I wasn't ready to share it yet. The records confirmed what I already knew. On the day I'd called, Marcus owed $16,800 in medical bills after insurance. I'd paid the full amount with my credit card, and the account had been marked as satisfied. The hospital had sent a letter to Marcus and Mom explaining that the balance had been resolved through a payment arrangement, which was technically true if vague. Looking at those records, I felt a mixture of pride and frustration. I'd made a significant financial sacrifice to help my family through a crisis, but that sacrifice was invisible to them. In their minds, I was someone who'd never shared my financial success with family, someone who chose personal comfort over helping people I claimed to love. The irony was overwhelming. I drained most of my savings to pay Marcus's medical bills, leaving me with limited resources for additional major expenses like truck down payments. But because I'd kept the payment secret, my current financial limitations seemed like selfishness rather than the natural consequence of previous generosity. I spent the afternoon thinking about whether to reveal what I'd done. The truth would definitely change Marcus and Mom's perspective on my refusal to help with the truck. They'd understand that I wasn't being selfish. I was being realistic about my financial capacity after already making a major sacrifice. But revealing the payment would also change our family dynamic in ways I wasn't sure I wanted. Marcus would feel obligated to pay me back, which could take years and strain their budget. Mom would feel guilty about calling me selfish. Both of them would know that they'd misjudged me badly, which might be awkward for everyone involved. There was also the question of timing. If I revealed the medical payment now, it might seem like I was using it as leverage to avoid helping with the truck. The gesture that had originally been motivated by love and generosity could appear calculating and self-serving. By evening, I'd made my decision. I was going to tell them the truth, not to make them feel guilty or to justify my position on the truck, but because our relationship deserved honesty. The secret was creating distance between us, and that distance was more costly than any temporary awkwardness the revelation might cause. Tomorrow, I'm going to Marcus's house to have a conversation that's 6 months overdue. I drove to Marcus and Mom's house this afternoon with a folder containing the hospital payment records and a stomach full of anxiety. I'd rehearsed various versions of this conversation in my head, but none of them felt adequate for the complexity of what I needed to explain. How do you tell someone that you've been secretly managing their crisis while they've been questioning your character? Marcus was in his garage when I arrived, working on a customer's water heater. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was doing the same type of work that had triggered his heart attack 10 months ago. He looked up when I walked in, and his expression was cautious but not unfriendly. Despite our recent tension, Marcus isn't the type to hold grudges. I asked if we could talk privately, and he suggested we sit on the back porch where we'd had countless conversations over the years. Mom was inside watching television, giving us space to work through whatever was happening between us. I started by apologizing for how I'd handled the truck situation. I told Marcus that my refusal to help had nothing to do with not caring about him or not considering him family. He listened without interrupting, his expression neutral but attentive. Then I pulled out the hospital records and placed them on the table between us. I explained that I had something to tell him about his medical bills, something I'd kept secret for 6 months. Marcus frowned, clearly not understanding where this was going. I told him the truth simply and directly. When he'd had his heart attack, I'd overheard him and Mom discussing selling the house to pay medical bills. I'd called the hospital and paid his entire outstanding balance, $16,800, using my savings. I'd asked the hospital not to mention my payment, which was why they'd received that vague letter about the account being satisfied. Marcus stared at the records for a long time without speaking. I watched his face cycle through confusion, understanding, shock, and something that might have been grief. When he finally looked up, his eyes were watery. His first question was why I hadn't told them. I explained that I'd known he would try to pay me back, and that I'd wanted him to focus on recovery rather than debt. I'd also known it would hurt his pride to accept such a large gift, so I'd made it invisible. Marcus was quiet for several more minutes, processing what I'd told him. Finally, he asked how much money I had left after paying his bills. I admitted that the payment had used most of my savings, leaving me with about $3,000 in emergency funds. My refusal to help with the truck hadn't been about selfishness. It had been about financial reality. The guilt on Marcus's face was immediate and painful to watch. He started apologizing for asking about the truck, for calling my motives into question, for making me feel like I didn't care about family. I stopped him and said that he'd had no way of knowing what I'd done, and that his request had been reasonable based on the information he'd had. We called Mom outside, and I explained the situation to her as well. Her reaction was similar to Marcus's, shock, followed by gratitude, followed by guilt about how she'd treated me over the truck issue. She kept saying she couldn't believe I'd carried this secret for 6 months while they questioned my generosity. The conversation that followed was one of the most honest we'd ever had as a family. Marcus talked about his pride and how difficult it was for him to accept help, even from people he loved. Mom discussed her fears about their financial security and how those fears had made her expect too much from me. I talked about my struggle to balance love and boundaries, generosity and self-preservation. Marcus immediately wanted to discuss paying me back, but I asked him to table that conversation for a while. I told him that forcing repayment would undermine the spirit of what I'd done, which was to help family during a crisis without expecting anything in return. We did talk about the truck situation, and Marcus's perspective had completely changed. He realized that asking for $15,000 after I'd already spent $16,800 was unreasonable, even if he hadn't known about the medical payment. He'd found a reliable used truck for $8,000 that would meet his business needs, and he was confident he could handle that purchase on his own. As we wrapped up our conversation, Marcus said something that stuck with me. He told me that learning about the medical payment had taught him the difference between expecting help and appreciating help. He'd gotten so focused on what he thought I should do that he'd lost sight of what I'd already done. That evening, I drove home feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The secret had been weighing on me more than I'd realized, creating distance in my most important relationships. Being honest about what I'd done hadn't solved all our family dynamics, but it had restored understanding and trust. Over the next few days, Marcus and Mom both made efforts to repair the damage from our truck disagreement. They acknowledged that they'd been unfair in their expectations and judgmental about my financial boundaries. More importantly, they seemed to understand that my success didn't create unlimited obligation to fund their wants. Marcus did end up buying the $8,000 used truck, which turned out to be perfect for his needs. It's reliable, practical, and completely paid for. He seems happier with this choice than he would have been with the expensive truck that required family assistance. We also established new guidelines for discussing money within our family. Future requests for help will be presented as requests, not expectations. We'll be honest about our financial situations instead of making assumptions. And we'll distinguish between crises that require immediate intervention and wants that can wait for better timing. Looking back, I realized that keeping the medical payment secret had created problems I hadn't anticipated. My family had felt free to judge my generosity because they didn't know about my previous sacrifice. I'd felt resentful about their expectations because they didn't understand my financial limitations. Honesty would have prevented months of misunderstanding and hurt feelings. The experience taught me that generosity without communication can be as problematic as selfishness. When you help people secretly, you deny them the opportunity to understand your sacrifices and adjust their expectations accordingly. You also deny yourself the recognition and gratitude that make generosity emotionally sustainable. 6 months later, our family relationships are stronger than they've been in years. Marcus's health remains stable. Mom has stopped worrying about their financial security, and I'm rebuilding my savings without pressure to fund major purchases for others. We've learned to talk honestly about money, boundaries, and expectations. Marcus still doesn't know that I've been putting his attempted repayment money into a separate savings account that I plan to give back to him someday. Some secrets are worth keeping, especially ones that preserve dignity while showing love. But the big secrets, the ones that affect relationships and understanding, those need to be shared, even when the conversations are difficult.